typically, in these days, I mean, the numbers were a little higher before, and now that with declining sales, it's gone down a little bit. These days you're looking at record deals in the neighborhood of $300,000 to $400,000 as a recording fund, all in, and that means that you have to pay for everything, and that like recording costs, and recording costs could easily be $300,000 or $200,000 or $250,000, whatever it might be. So. It's a little misleading to think, oh, I'll get $400,000 and we'll all live off of that. The reality is when you sign a record deal, the chances of the band being able to split $100,000 is pretty slim. The band might be splitting somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000, but you got people to pay out of that too. You got to pay your lawyer, which could be anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 or more if they've been working with you for a long time, or depending on what the deal is. You've got to pay the manager, so there's typically 20% right there, so and then you split it. So let's pretend you get $50,000 and you split it 4 ways. That's only $12,500 each, and you can't even live a year off of that. I mean, nowhere near. It's not that lucrative of a proposition. And the royalties, the way the royalties are structured, you just won't get any. There's about 15 or 20 pages in each contract that explain, in a very very roundabout way, why you're never going to get any royalties. The gist of it is, if you want to do sort of the back of the thumbnail sketch, is you wouldn't even be entitled to any royalties whatsoever until you've sold about 1 million records. And when you sell 1 million records, that doesn't mean you get $1 million royalty check then. What it means is that after you sell the 1,001th record, you might be getting a royalty on that record. Because everything's recoupable, your royalty's very low. You got to pay a lot of people out of that. Producers, if you have any samples, anything like that. You got to pay all these different people out of that money, and the whole game is kind of rigged so that the artist doesn't really get royalties.
What's recoupable?
Well, more and more things all the time. I mean, recording costs are 100% recoupable, and video costs tend to be 50% recoupable from your audio sales and 100% recoupable from your video sales. But even then, costs over a certain amount then become 100% recoupable from audio. And independent promotion is typically either 50 or 100% recoupable, as is independent marketing. All these different costs come in from different areas, and it's not at all uncommon to have maybe $1 million in recoupable costs. I mean, there's some things that aren't, like consumer advertising isn't recoupable, but there's enough recoupable stuff that you really don't collect money. I mean, it's interesting actually, because when when I was working at Capitol, my first job. I was doing a lot of stuff with Blue Note Records, which is owned by Capitol, and that was sort of another part of that story about how I got along and how I got to where I am, was that when business affairs, which is where the lawyers are in the record company, it was very tightly budgeted, and it always is. It's run very thinly. There's I think there was 3 lawyers or something to handle an entire record label and Blue Note Records. And so what happened was that, typically Blue Note didn't get dealt with. The Blue Note stuff didn't really happen because something was always more pressing on the pop side or the rock side or the hip-hop side or whatever. And, typically the Blue Note deals were missing a zero, and it made them very uninteresting. So instead of maybe a $300,000 deal, it was a $30,000 deal. So I saw that as an opportunity, and I said, well, why don't you just let me deal with Blue Note? Because no one else is, and I can help them out. You can look over my work, and I'm still in law school when I'm doing this. So I ended up de facto being like the head of business affairs for Blue Note while I was in law school, because I was the only one who was dealing with it. So I was talking to Bruce Lundvall, 5, 6, 7 times a day. We became very close. Tom Everett, all that. It was really great. It was part of this team, and it was really one of the funnest times of my career, where it was really. There was sort of a esprit de corps, with Blue Note, and there was a real sense of identity there. And what I learned from that, one of the things I learned from that, was that jazz musicians, these guys weren't making anything on these deals. I mean, and it wasn't because no one loved them. I mean, Bruce, and Tom and those guys, they go out of their way all the time. They did everything they could to make sure that, the musicians, within the realm of the financial reality of their situation, that they would do everything they could for them. They'd try and, get them some money if they needed money. They'd try to, when I remember, sadly on more than one occasion, where Bruce would pick up the funeral costs for people when they died. I mean, because no one else was there and they didn't have any money. No, no. I think actually that was just doing the right thing. I mean, Bruce is. I mean, I think still one of the last great record men. Kind of guy who would do something because it's the right thing to do, and and loves musicians and loves being with them. Very close over over the years with different people. Dexter Gordon. I mean, Bruce's impression of Dexter Gordon is priceless, and the stories he's told me about Dexter were just fabulous stories. But what I learned, one of the things I learned there, was that in the jazz business, and I think you could probably fairly say this about a lot of niche markets in music, that they weren't making money off the records. Everybody was unrecouped. The advances, they weren't even really advances. I mean, the $30,000 recording fund, you have to make the record with that. So maybe the artist gets to pocket $5,000, and clearly that's not enough for anything. But what they were doing was that the record was a very expensive calling card for everything else they do, for especially their live shows. So, maybe an artist that would be able to maybe pocket $5,000 on releasing their own record, they might be making $5,000 a night when they're playing. So that was sort of the game, was to get onto a good record label, especially like Blue Note or Verve, one of the real quality, biggest name labels, and use that and the recognition that you get as a result of that to increase their fees for everything else, and that was really where they were making their money on the road. And I think that that's something that not understanding that is what's made, I think, pop music, and I mean pop in a broad sense, including rock and hip hop and stuff like that. It's made it very difficult for people who do that music, because they look at their royalties. They look at this. I'm going to get royalties checks from the label, and I'm going to be rich, and the royalties will just come in every 6 months. I'll get a check. It doesn't work like that. If they were playing the same game, where they realize that the exposure you get from the record company is you then turn around and use that to make money elsewhere, then that's a much more realistic way to approach your career. And you see that a lot, and I think hip hop's done a great job of that, where you see all these people who become big. They're into 50 different things all of a sudden. They're doing endorsements for cell phone companies. They're doing clothing lines. They're selling merch. They're making money on their tours and things like that. And that's how that game really works. Because what you see, where for instance it doesn't work is with a rock band. A rock band, when they get to the point where they're not making money on the road, then they're screwed. Because it used to be very common, for instance, for to take a young rock band and send them out on the road and give them tour support and keep them going. But the problem with that is that if you don't make money when you're on the road, where are you going to make money? You're not going to make it on the records very much. You're not going to make it if you're not making it live. Maybe some merch, selling merchandise or something like that. But that's really not enough. I think that the correct business model to think about really is to, at least in most genres, is to be thinking about the live show, because also that's the one thing that no one can take from you. If you are concerned about people, sharing your files or whatever, or copying your CDs or and not paying you, the one thing that they really can't steal is your live show, and you can use that. The live show to really be the platform for everything else that you do, and everything else kind of fits into it. There is money to be made. Certainly, even as an independent artist, you could sell your own records. I think that's probably the best way to make money as an independent artist, the best way to make money on records as an independent would be to sell your own. But you also have to, at that point, be your own record company. You're not going to make very much if you license it to someone else, or if you, sign it over to someone else or something like that. But you stand a chance of making some money if you have sort of the wherewithal to sell them yourself and market them yourself, and do a good job doing that. I think actually the path for an independent artist and an artist that wants to be signed by a major label is really kind of the same from my perspective, because the way that that the major labels will pick you, it really isn't this concept of this idea that a record that someone loves comes across their desk and they jump up and down and go, wow, this is really great, I gotta sign this, let's go, let's do it. That doesn't really happen anymore. It kind of used to, but less and less and less. And what's happened is that over the years, certainly over like the last 10 years, or even 20 years maybe, it's gotten just more and more and more competitive. For instance, before MTV, you didn't have to look great. After MTV, you had to look great. It wasn't enough that you were fantastically talented and put on a great show. You also had to look good, and you had to fit into the way that MTV wants you to look. So, that's one thing. And then, as time went on, it became more and more and more competitive. And what you start seeing is that no matter how good your record is, no one really cares unless you're selling them, unless you sold a lot of records. If you sold 5,000 or 10,000 records as an independent, that would attract attention, or getting a lot of airplay, locally, or regionally, or wherever. Or, having a tremendous live draw. I mean, you look at a band like OAR, of a Revolution, and they were out there, playing in front of, 1,000 people a night and selling a lot of records through CD Baby. And, that's what attracted Lava to sign them, was that activity. And so really you see that a lot. That's really the case now. Everybody needs a story. You need to have a story of sales, airplay, people paying to see your show, things like that. So, just making a great record and sending it to someone, even if they love it. I mean, they might listen to it every day. They might love it. They'll listen to it with their wife and, all that kind of stuff. But they won't put the money into it. So, the point being that if you're an artist, you have to do that. You have to get that going. You have to get, stoke the fire and get get sales and get airplay and whatever it is that you can get, because whether you want to go into a major label or whether you want to stay independent, it's the same route. I think that the only reason to do it, and it's really part of the major, to actually sell your publishing, to sell the copyrights, I think the only time you'd really want to do that is if you're in a major label situation, you're signed to a major label, and you need the money. Which is really sort of how it worked a lot up until fairly recently. What would happen would be that an artist would get signed to a major record label, and as we talked about a little bit before, the money you get from that major record label on signing is not that much. You split it between 4 people. You got to pay the lawyer. You got to pay the manager. At the end of the day, it's not going to be enough to live on. So what would happen is then you'd turn around and do a publishing deal, and the publishing deal would be maybe another $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, of which no cost came out. So now you're talking about some real money, where you can live off of that for a while. So what would happen is you make your record deal, and then you make your publishing deal, and get the money from that and live off of that, while you're hoping that you get broken and turn into a star. Now at that point, typically you'd only have to sell half the copyright, because when especially at those days, it was really, that was the common deal, was a co-publishing deal. Deals started off originally as being what they call songwriter agreements, where you transfer 100% of the copyright to the publisher, and the money is split 50-50 between the publisher and the writer. And so there's sort of a confusing concept that in publishing, where there's the writer's share and the publisher's share. And what that really means is 50% of the money is the publisher's share and 50% of the money is the writer's share. But sometimes you talk about 100% of the writer's share or 100% of the publisher's share, and what you're really saying is 50% of the money. So it gets confusing. You have to get used to it a little bit. So originally those deals, the publishers were, taking 100% of the copyright. And really the music business started as a publishing business. Not everyone realizes that, the music business, traditionally the music business was really about song plugging and song publishing and selling sheet music. In the late part of the 19th century and for most of the 20th century, or about half the 20th century, that was really the business. Records only came in later. And so typically what would happen is a publisher would, get some songs written for them by someone and get interested in it. The publisher would run around and plug the songs with the big acts of the day. They would say, sing this song, and with the idea that if people heard famous singers singing these songs, they'd go buy the sheet music, because people at that time also, they all used to play instruments. Like my mom's generation, everyone kind of had something that they played. They played piano, they sang. It was making music was a more communal thing. It wasn't quite as audience artist distinction as it is now. So at that point, it was kind of a big risk on the publisher's standpoint, because they had a lot of work to do. It wasn't like in the record business, which I'll get to in a second about how it's changed. But and there was payola going on too. There was all kinds of stuff. They would have, and if you look back at old billboards and old varieties, back from the turn of the century, from the turn of the 20th century, they were all complaining about payola, and and what it cost to plug songs. They would pay cash payments to singers basically to sing the songs. So anyway, that was a justification for the the publisher owning 100% of the copyright and splitting the money 50-50 was actually kind of a lot of work to be done, and it was a risky business. Now, what happened it was about the middle of the 20th century, around 1950 or so, when finally records overtook publishing as being the music business. It was generating more money than publishing was. And so what was happening then, this is probably in the 50s and 60s, was that what started happening is that if you had a record deal, actually it's probably really more towards the 70s, I guess, because at that point in the 50s and 60s, people were still recording other people's songs. And so what happened in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s really, when you had people like the Beatles out there, artists like the Beatles who wrote their own songs and were tremendously successful doing it, and everyone wanted to write their own songs now, And so what happened was that it became very, very common for bands to write their own songs. And even today, like you look, most certainly in the rock genre, no one really records anybody else's songs. They pretty much write all their own stuff. So what happened was that the risk was taken out of the music publishing business, because what would happen as a writer, now you are the writer/artist. Well, you have a record deal, and you can go into the publisher and say, look, I'm selling, I have someone here who's going to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in my career, and you don't have to. So what would happen was really the publishing business became more of like an investment type of business. It was about loans, you would parcel out a piece of your copyright in order to get some money now and give up some future royalties in order to get current money. And even that would switch. So what happened was you switched to what's called a co-publishing deal, where the writer and the publisher would now co-own the copyright 50-50, and they'd split the money, with the writer still getting their 50%, but then the writer gets another 25% because they co-own the copyright. So they're splitting the publishing share. That's why they call it co-publishing. So now the writer gets 75% of the money basically, because they're 100% of the writer's share and 50% of the publisher's share.
But the publisher controls the copyright.
Yeah, but the publisher does the administration. And even then it's also one of the other important modifications was that there would be what's called retention periods, which means that it's not perpetual rights anymore. Like in a modern publishing deal, you won't really see perpetual rights being signed over to the publisher. It's usually some term of years, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, but it's limited, and that's important. So you get your copyrights back, and you get a second bite at the apple. Now, Under those circumstances, that's not a bad deal to make. If someone's going to give you a few $100,000 for 50% of your copyrights, 50% of the copyright, and you get it back someday, in 10, 15 years, that's a pretty good deal. I don't have any problem. I think there's a lot of good reasons to do that deal. Now, the other kind of deal that can be done is more of just an administration deal, where the artist, or the writer, keeps 100% of the copyright and just licenses it, basically licenses the administration rights to someone for a while, so that the writer doesn't have to do all the paperwork and issue licenses and do all that kind of stuff. Someone else takes care of it for him, and typically those rates, the administrator would charge somewhere between 10 and 20% for those services, and those deals tend to be fairly short, in a 3 to 5 year range, sometimes even 2 years or 1 year, depending on how much leverage you might have at the time. So, long story short, though, it's important to own your own copyrights, and that's why I think for instance, the publishing business is a much gentler business in a way, because you're not getting your copyrights taken away from you in the normal course of business. The record business, in the normal course of business, you're going to lose your copyrights, in sound recordings at least. Certainly as an independent artist, or someone who's just maybe even wants to be on a major label someday but isn't yet, the most important thing I would say is make sure you keep all your copyrights, because you might not understand it right this second, and you're thinking about today, and you're thinking about being a star now, but those copyrights will last longer than you. Those copyrights are, the term of copyright by definition is life plus, or currently it's life plus 70. So, and it's probably only going to get longer. So these are things that you can own. These are real assets. But, as you sort of get older, you start to realize that if you start when you're 18 and you make a record every couple of years, and you manage your career in a good way, and you're able to sort of make it work. You're able to keep it together, and maybe you're not, super rich and a super big rock star, but you're making money, and that every year or every couple of years you're going to have a bunch of new copyrights, and you're going to have, this album when you're 18, and this album when you're 20, and this album when you're 22.